Okay, the next page, Progressivism and Reforms. Jacob Riis published a book called How the Other Half Lived, which showed how despicable things were for immigrants. His goal was to get immigration restricted, which is interesting because he was an immigrant. But he kind of showed the ugly side of immigration in slums and cities. The next two kind of go together. Immigration chart of the late 1800s, new immigrants versus old immigrants. Older immigrants were the antebellum people who came primarily from Ireland and Germany. The new immigrants come primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe, which is the next term on the list if you were paying attention. So an immigration chart would show you that in 1880 and 90 you have a lot of people coming from Poland, but virtually no Polish people coming in 1820. Okay? So the new immigrants, Southern and Eastern Europeans, mostly Catholics and Jews, and they didn't assimilate very quickly. So why was there no immigration restriction in the late that should be 1800s, not 1900s? Because there was a need for cheap labor. Every time labor unions or nativists started talking about restricting immigration, guys who owned big factories would protest because they wanted cheap labor. Chinese Exclusion Act 1882 did what? It put a 10-year moratorium on Chinese entering America. So why did labor unions oppose the Chinese Exclusion Act?
Let Chinese people into working over there.
No. Adam.
They put a small tax on people coming in to see if they could pay, like...
You know, that didn't bother labor unions. But what did labor unions want? They wanted more restriction than what it gave, right? Did it really hurt labor unions that the Chinese, or help labor unions that the Chinese weren't coming into America? No, where did the Chinese live? Mostly the West Coast. How many big factories were there in San Francisco or LA in 1880? None. Where were the big factories? Back east. So did stopping Chinese immigrants really help labor unions get rid of immigrant labor? Not at all. Okay, so they argued that it didn't do anything to help them. All the following added to or caused the urban city except, I don't know what this question was getting at. Did the railroad add to or cause the urban city? Not really. Was there federal improvement investment? Get real? No. Immigration? Yes. And then emigration with an E? Yes. Both of those added to the urban city. When in U.S. history we see emigration with an E, what are they referring to? People who moved where? What do you mean? Country to city is usually what it refers to. So sort of east and west, if you will. But people moving from the country farm into the city. Okay? Why would you move from the country to the city? Jobs. And there was the feeling that you could make more money as a factory worker than you could as a farmer, which is probably about a break-even proposition, actually. Sewage problems in cities? Yes, there were. Okay? They're just starting putting in sewage systems in the late 1800s. Before that, and still in the late 1800s, most people still have an outdoor house, an outhouse, a privy, whatever you want to call it. People are still taking their nighttime waste and tossing it out the window rather than walking it down to the outhouse. There's no garbage collection per se, so people just throw stuff out in the streets. How did city bosses get power, or how did they flourish? By rewarding constituents with jobs and services? Did they get it from rural controlled legislatures? Did they get it by exploiting workers, or from the middle class? Rewarding constituents, exactly. Okay? Think of the movie about the mouse. Faisal goes to America, Faisal, whatever, okay? And there's that big cat in the movie. who's the political boss, and he rewards the little mice for voting for him, okay? Tammany Hall, the headquarters of the Democratic Party in New York City. The biggest Tammany Hall person, political boss, was the next guy, Boss Tweed. Eventually, Boss Tweed was convicted of milking $200 million out of New York City. Because what made Boss Tweed different than most political bosses? Yeah, he actually was a politician himself. He became the mayor of New York. Most political bosses were like puppet masters. They controlled the mayor, but they were always behind the scenes just collecting the money. Boss Tweed was out there in front himself. There's a Boss Tweed cartoon, Strength in Counting, shows municipal corruption. Boss Tweed is a very large, heavy person in all the cartoons. He's kind of bald. His suit jacket never reaches, to touch its sides. You can't button it, type of thing. It's always over a vest. The major cartoonist of Boss Tweed is Thomas Nast, the next term. Nast's most famous cartoon of Boss Tweed has Boss Tweed looking like a vulture, like a big fat vulture. And it's Boss Tweed. I mean, it's very obvious. And Boss Tweed hated Thomas Nast because he maintained the immigrants couldn't read, but they sure could tell a picture. And he was always after Nast. From Nast, we also get the donkey and the elephant as symbols of the Republican and the Democratic Party. A cartoon with political machine buying votes. There's a politician striding through the voting booths. You see voting booths, and the idea is he's going to buy votes. Because remember, voting in the late 1800s worked this way. Dylan goes into to vote, and he asks for a Democratic ballot. He gets a ballot that has all the Democratic candidates marked already. Elena goes in, she asks for a Republican ballot. She gets the ballots marked with all the Republican candidates. Okay? I'm watching Dylan come in and request a Democratic ballot, so I say to my trusty assistant, Matthew, give him a reward. So Matthew gives him a nickel or a token for a drink at the bar next door, or gives him a job for next week, or whatever the case might be. Jeremy does the same thing for the Republican Party and gives Elena a reward for voting for his party. Okay? Do we understand how party machine politics work? Cult of domesticity and the new woman. In the late 1800s, the cult of domesticity is referred to as the sphere of influence sometimes. But the idea is that there's still a cult of domesticity going on. Women don't work unless they're single. And then they are teachers, nurses, social workers, that kind of thing. The idea is that women now add a few new things to their family's chores, like decorating the house became a big deal in the late 1800s because homes became much more elaborate, even amongst middle class. Do you remember the DBQ that we did for the semester exam, which showed a middle class home and it was a large house, okay, probably an 8-room house, at least. Women in college, they finally started colleges in the late 1800s for women alone, like the Seven Sisters schools like Vassar, Smith, Barnard, etc. That had serious education, the idea that women could be educated, though there were those critics who said women's brains would explode if you gave them too much education. The real reality is that most of those women who went to college never worked. They never used their education for a job. They used their education for conversation, for making sure their kids got a good education, that kind of thing. Women in the Christian Union. The Christian Union was a group that was aimed at prohibition or temperance. By late 1800s, we're not talking about temperance anymore. We're talking prohibition, which means total outright ban of alcohol. Probably one of the more famous prohibition people is Carrie Nation. Remember, she's the lady who goes into the bars with the big axe and chops them up. Chops up the naked woman portrait over the bar. Okay?